My name's Albert Trithart, and I'm joined by our resident sustaining peace experts, Yusuf Mahmood and Andrea O'Sullivan. So it's been almost a year since the UN Security Council and General Assembly adopted identical resolutions on sustaining peace. So we thought this would be a great opportunity to revisit this concept and look at how it's been received over the past year and how it's looking in practice. So this is an interactive conversation, so if you have any questions or comments, we'd encourage you to share those on Facebook. So to start off, could you both give us an overview of how this concept came about?
This concept came about as a result of three global studies on peace and security that were commissioned over 2014 and 2015. And the three of them questioned the way we have been thinking about conflict and peace, and have questioned particularly the way we help countries emerging from conflict build peace. And the peace building paradigm that is still in existence tends to give the power to outside experts who tend to describe what's wrong with a country and ready to provide remedies. The sustaining peace framework that has been promoted and recommended by these three reviews, basically motivated by the humility to learn from what still works in countries under stress. Also motivated by the respect that every society has capacities, not just needs, however pressing these needs may be. The sustaining peace agenda, or the sustaining peace framework, revisits the starting point of how to build peace. So far, the peace building agenda tends to have conflict as the starting point, conflict as a referent. In other words, what is wrong that can be fixed? And so the sustaining peace paradigm would have a very important implication of how to analyze a country's situation. So instead of focusing on the factors that drive and sustain conflict, we would want to focus on those factors that are associated with peace, those resilient factors that are associated with peace on which we can build. So it's really a switch of the starting point. The other point, I think, that we try to promote in trying to interpret the joint resolution that you have mentioned is that the primary drivers are the national and local actors. And the journey of helping people build peaceful society starts from building on what they know and what they already have, rather than what we think they need.
And related to that, I think for me, understanding sustaining peace, also it's useful to see how is it different from peace building, or at least the way that the UN community has understood peace building the last several years before the review processes that Yusuf mentioned. And for one, peace building had really been narrowed to this technical project-based approach. So sustaining peace is really saying, let's break out of thinking about peace building as short-term projects that we need to finance and perform in country, and instead really aim for transformative systems change. So it's really looking at the bigger picture, as Yusuf said. And also this shift, peace building was really seen as a post-conflict exercise. So this is also a lot about timing. Sustaining peace instead can happen before conflict. It certainly happens in the midst of and during conflict, and it can also then be something that we work on after conflict. Related to that, it's quite a unifying force across the UN's work. So part of the sustaining peace agenda is that it says sustaining peace and peace building is everybody's business. It's part of human rights, it's part of development, and of course it's part of the peace and security work of the UN. So all three pillars. And then I'd also just add, Yusuf mentioned really this emphasis on local and national actors. And if you go back to the one-year-old now text of the resolution on sustaining peace, it does place a greater emphasis on inclusion and on women's leadership than previous peace-building work has done. And from other research that came out last year during the peace and security review processes, we know how important that leadership is, women's leadership and gender equality to the sustainability of peace. And so I'll throw in some of that here, that we have a wonderful, huge data set. The largest data set on gender and women's roles in the world is captured in the book Sex and World Peace by Valerie Hudson. And that research, for example, tells us that gender equality is a stronger predictor of a country's peacefulness than that country's level of democracy, than its GDP, or than its religion. Another study tells us that as the percentage of women in a country's parliament grows by 5%, that state is 5 times less likely to use violence when confronted with international conflict. And so sustaining peace is really saying, to really leverage that potential of gender equality, we have to make sure that women are not just consulted, are not just someone that are included, but that are really fully participating and put in the lead of peace building.
So now that it's been a year since the resolutions from the General Assembly and Security Council on sustaining peace, what can we say about how this concept has been received, and what are some of the challenges it's facing?
So first, it's been a really fascinating process to accompany. And here at IPI, we've been lucky to be involved in the 3 review processes and also to work very closely with some of the government representatives here at the UN who negotiated the resolutions. And I would say from my time in the UN community here, this is something that they have been most excited about. And again, because it has this really transformative potential. So certainly many, many governments stood up at the adoption of this resolution a year ago and said, this is something that can make a difference for people facing conflict and violence on the ground. So that's been a really inspiring process to watch. It's also an agenda that is meant to be universal, so applied to the typical countries we tend to talk about here when we speak about conflict, but also applied to the United States and applied to other countries that we tend to think of broadly as peaceful countries. But that framing has also raised some tensions. The fact that this removes conflict from the peace-building conversation, that says this is something that needs to apply to everyone, has left some member states and governments here slightly confused about how does that work in practice, how do we define sustaining peace, again, across different areas of international work, and why should it apply to countries that view themselves as largely peaceful? So I think here at headquarters, the UN is really facing the question again of what does it mean in practice? But there's another important level of challenge, and that's for community level peace workers who, instead of saying, what does this mean in practice, are really saying, why does this matter for my peace practice? If you're someone working on civic engagement in Zimbabwe, it's not so clear why another internationally adopted document holds a lot of meaning for your work. And so through several projects, one that we have at the moment is a 9-country study on local networks for peace. We've been able to bring this resolution and some analysis of it to country-level peace builders and engage them in speaking about what it means as well.
I think just to complement what Andrea said, this concept, even though it gained some conceptual consensus through these resolutions, it came about at a time when there is still mistrust among member states and what this means to them. You have to remember, every time we talk about peace, people are wary whether security is not far behind, whether this is a new paradigm that's going to be yet a new normative Trojan horse to justify intervention in other people's business. Also, as Andrea mentioned, people feel sustaining peace is not their concern. Why? Because their referent is still conflict. I am not in conflict. I have no violence, and therefore sustaining peace only concerns those countries in or emerging from conflict. So that is one of the biggest challenge that I wanted to add in the way. The third one is that it became a nice new fad for those who are in the peace building and state building arena. They've adopted it to justify existing ways of doing things, whereas sustaining peace is really a shift in the way we think about conflict and peace, where the starting point is peace and not conflict. And as long as we have not liberated the concept of peace from conflict, it's going to continue to be a challenge in reframing it and in making practical what it means for all countries.
And I'd just add here, if anyone's watching who is working on peace building or works in a conflict space or works to really help build those factors that make peace, we'd love to also hear, how do you feel sustaining peace relates to your work? What does this newly framed concept mean to you?
So could you both speak to how we can address these challenges? And in particular, considering one of the challenges you mentioned is that many people don't necessarily understand what sustaining peace means in practice. Could you offer some examples of what it looks like?
I think at IPI here, the International Peace Institute, we have done basically we have taken three initiatives to help reassure and cleanse this particular concept from the legacies of conflict. One is we have organized a series of formal and informal discussions to, in a sense, make explicit some of the unspoken underlying assumption behind sustaining peace. And so conceptually try to unpack it in terms that is meaningful and rings a bell for member states and other stakeholders. The second thing we have done is and we have done that first thing through our writings, through analysis, through opinion pieces, and so on and so forth. The second initiative we have taken is to organize monthly conversation, which we baptize, in a sense, Conversation on Prevention for Sustaining Peace. And the reason we chose this title without the word conflict prevention is precisely to make prevention for the services of peace rather than for preventing conflict. And the way we have done that is we invite ambassadors, the permanent representative of the UN, to really discuss practical cases of what sustaining peace looks like for countries that they are dealing with. So we have the Peace Building Commission chairperson, we had an elected members of the Security Council come, we have the chair of a particular configuration focusing on Burundi. And let me just give you one or two examples just to say what. So for example, for Burundi, there are two ways of looking at this difficult situation. One is to say there is fighting among the elites about power, how power is exercised, maintained, and acquired. And there are violations of human rights, and they have terrible consequences for innocent population. All of that is true. Even though the degree to which this is true may be disputed, but there are enough evidence. That's one way of looking at it. And therefore, the prescriptions tend to be how can we mitigate these problems? On the other hand, if you apply a sustaining peace lens to this difficult situation Burundi is going through, you will find at least three things that's going well. One is that the population tells you we are tired of war. We are not going to go back to the violence of the past. So there is resilience, there is resistance to be dragged into it. Second, we will discover that there are enormous capacities for peace working in the field. So, for example, we discovered that there are 5,000 women mediators throughout Burundi trying to calm rumors, trying to address grievances, bring political parties and various people together. Their civil society is still working despite the difficulties and the shrinking space. There are various media outlets that are still working. And so from a sustaining peace perspective, the role of international community is not simply to come with state-centric, ready-made remedies, whether they are sanctions or sending troops, whatever, but say, okay, these are the resilient capacities that are still working. We need to identify them and strengthen them. And therefore, the chances of helping Burundians to build the foundation for self-sustainable peace is much greater. I'll give you an example of Ghana. Ghana adopted what we call a meta policy for peace. In other words, they said, peace is not something you take for granted. It needs to be nurtured once you have it. It needs to be cultivated. It's like many other things. You cannot take them. They have to be given. And once they are given and acquired, you cannot take them for granted. So they have created what they call a National Council for Peace that oversees all government's activities to ensure that whatever it is done, do not unwittingly exacerbate the fault lines that may exist. So conflict, from a sustaining peace perspective, is not something that is terrible. It happens in any societies. However, how you deal with it when it emerges is what is the strength of the sustaining peace. So what are processes, attitudes, structures, and institutions nations put in place in order to deal with conflict through a peaceful means?
And one wonderful peace builder we work with has a phrase related to that he says that conflict is inevitable, but violence is a choice. And so for me, sustaining peace is really about setting up the structures that help people not make that choice as much as possible, continue to choose peace. Because of course, in this conversation, it's critical to remember that in every country, even those most affected by war, the vast majority of citizens do not participate in violence themselves. And that's always an important one for me to, I think, remember and bring up in this. But yes, on the example of Ghana that Yusuf raised, we've also looked at how that National Peace Council is linked to locally led and locally elected local peace committees. And that's a common infrastructure for peace that has been tried in multiple countries as a way to link local work to the national. And related to that, the Sustaining Peace report that came out and ultimately led to this resolution had another great phrase in it about this new renewed role for the UN, which was that in today's context of people being more involved than ever, of calling for more participation and more democracy around the world, it's time for the UN to do less but facilitate more. And I think that's a question we're asking is, what does that look like? How can that be played out in a very positive way? In Burundi and many other countries, the peace builders we work with are really kind of squeezed between a national government that is not necessarily supportive and giving wonderful grants and training and support to their civil society actors. And so a question becomes, what role is it for the UN and its peace-building programs in those more difficult settings as well? But just, I think, to finish up on this, again, we want to emphasize that it's important to be looking here and in countries that we call the West, and to say sustaining peace applies here as well. So we know from our work on cities under stress and challenges for peace in the urban context that even here in the US, we have many cities with high violence rates, with children growing up in highly segregated schools. And this sustaining peace work would have many lessons for that as well, to say, what are the assets, what are the sources of resilience in those places that are helping people to avoid violence and build more peaceful communities?
So thank you for everyone engaging with us on Facebook. We've gotten a couple questions. So we have one question from Jean in Montreal, and he raises the important link between sustaining peace and the Sustainable Development Goals. So he's wondering, what do you think of, in particular, SDG 16 and its targets and how they relate to sustaining peace?
Maybe I'll attempt that, and then because peace in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, peace is both an enabler and an outcome, and therefore we are of the view, and many people are of the view, and here at IPI we promote it, is that if you implement sustainable development goals, you're actually promoting peace and sustaining it. And therefore, sustaining peace becomes a governance and development function rather than simply a peace and security function. The other point I wish to make is that member states have recognized, and this is basically the purpose of Goal 16 and its related targets, but also all the other, many of the other goals, is that strengthening transparent, accountable, inclusive institutions is good for sustainable development and is equally good for sustainable peace. They are intimately interdependent. There is no way you can separate these two elements. And so these two agenda actually work together, and they have increasingly large consensus. I think the last point I want to say about the Sustainable Development Goals, it's basically a global social contract between the states and citizens. And when we know the tension between states and citizens and the visceral mistrust that exists in many countries between their state and the citizens, this is a good way of bridging that mistrust and building cooperative relationship so we can better unleash the leadership potential of citizens so they can contribute to sustainable development and therefore sustainable peace.
Great. So we also just want to thank Rebecca from Food Think Tank for sharing her link to her work on women and peace. And then we have one other question from Anthony on how you could view health equality from a gender perspective through the lens of sustaining peace, in particular in post-conflict societies. If either of you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. So we know that conflict affects men and women differently. We know that the health implications are different. We also know that after conflict, since this question raises the post-conflict time, there's often actually a spike in violence against women and domestic violence rather than a decline. So, if you also tie this back to the Sustainable Development Goals that Yusuf was just mentioning. Goal 5 is on gender equality and women's full and equal participation. And in our work here on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, we've been really saying that goal is just as important to sustaining peace as Goal 16, and they're all so closely related in any case. I think there's a number out there that there's more than 36 targets across the SDGs that relate to inclusivity and nonviolence, so you really do have this interaction. But on this question, I would say it's so critical to approach health and equality from a gender perspective before and during conflict. We know that when women are able to participate, they are key to reaching peace agreements. They're key to post-conflict development. We've done some work earlier this year with the McKinsey Global Institute, who gave us amazing numbers that our team, I think, can post about how women's economic participation unlocks huge funds and levels of development in post-conflict countries. So,
yeah. Maybe a quick comment. We used health as an entry point for demystifying sustaining peace and help people move from using conflict as a starting point, but rather peace. And because it's hard, so we use the health. So there are two ways of saying I'm healthy. One way say, I am free of diseases, therefore I'm healthy. So that's one way of saying I'm healthy. Another way saying, I'm going to study all the people that have enjoyed well-being for so long, and then find out what is it that they do that I can learn from to maintain my health. We also use health to make the point that sustaining peace is really a public good. It's like education. It's like security. So building and sustaining peace by governments and society is a public good. And you cannot have an equal society if women's health is not factored in. There is no way women can participate if they are not healthy, if they are not free from violence. We could do everything we can, but if they are not healthy, it affects every part of society. And therefore, there is no chance for sustaining peace without sustainable health services for women and girls.
So we're just about out of time, but do either of you have any closing thoughts on sustaining peace that you want to share?
In closing, I think I'd like to raise another agenda that hasn't come up in the conversation, which is the Youth, Peace and Security agenda that has really emerged over the last year. A different UN Security Council resolution was passed on that. There's a big global study happening on it now. But to me, I think youth leadership is another area that can pull a lot of this work together. When we look at youth actors, we see a population that is often talked about in regards to being committing violence and at risk of violence, but in reality, the vast majority of young people are not committing violence. So many have wonderful initiatives to work for peace in their communities here and in other countries. So I would say that's another space to watch, of one that can really pull together a lot of these diverse parts and help us to see what sustaining peace looks like in different countries.
I think I would like to invite our audience and those who are watching us and beyond to really ask themselves, what is it that I can do in a world that is so fractious, where we hear more and more about violence, in a world where prevention through war rather than through diplomacy seems to be the norm, and ask themselves, what is it I can do in my country, in my community, and hopefully make the shift that it's not because we study war, we move towards building peace through strengths and through wars, that we can build peace. And ask themselves, what is it that I can do to contribute to this paradigm shift? So sustaining peace starts with us, with me, with everybody. And that's would be my appeal.
Great. Thank you, Yusuf. Thank you, Andrea. And thank you to everyone joining us on Facebook. I'd encourage you to visit our website at www.ipinst.org. Excuse me. We'll be shortly launching an additional website with further resources and research on sustaining peace. So you'll be able to find the link to that there. And if you enjoyed this video and would like to see future IPI Facebook Live videos, I'd encourage you to subscribe. Thank you.
Thank you.